our summer speaker series. We're so thrilled today to have such a talented audience. We have two of our own leaders in CASBO, Kelly Burks, who we'll introduce in more detail in a moment. Jennifer, thank you. And then we also have one of our partner firms, Keenan, and Frank Cardoza is joining us along with Sarah Bachez, our Chief Governmental Relations Officer. So you're going to get to hear this morning from this panel of experts who have certainly experience and wisdom to impart around this important topic of these natural disasters, as they seem to be a part of our world these days, unfortunately. So we're going to be able to hear about some of the best practices and preparation, and certainly we're all experienced at this point in some of those recovery efforts afterwards as well. But the panelists, again, will walk us through that. Just a few logistics before we get started. You'll see in the Q&A that we do have this presentation posted. So that's available to you. We're also recording this. And then Sarah will be facilitating a conversation around questions that you're going to be, that you are asking in the Q&A. So feel free to fill that up. We'll ask our experts to respond to that with their experience and wisdom. And with no further ado, I'll turn it over to our panel. So again, thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to learning more from you over this next hour.
Okay, so I'm Frank Cardoza with Keenan Associates out of the Rancho Cordova office, and today we're going to be doing a natural disaster preparedness overview. There are three pretty broad topics, so I'm going to try and focus on what's relevant, and I encourage folks to please ask questions at the end. We're covering a lot of material, so I'm going to be moving relatively quickly. So next slide, please. So emergency preparedness. Pre-pandemic, the focus was really kind of that FEMA approach. So we had some terrorism activity that happened. So we were looking at fires on site, flood, earthquake, tsunami, those regional disasters that might happen. It seems as time goes on, it continues to evolve, and we're finding that what didn't used to be present in our locations is now creeping in. So next slide, please. So there are lots of resources out there that can help us out. When we were looking at it, again, this is the pre-pandemic days, as well as looking at the COVID-19, because we had some other things like SARS and H1N1 bird flu that was floating around out there. FEMA was a resource. They're still out there. They have lots of different materials that you can use to look at it from kind of a global perspective. Next slide, please. Looking at it from a fire perspective, based on your region, there are local resources, but CAL FIRE has a lot of information that can help you with preventing wildfires actually damaging your structures on your campuses. Everything from looking at vegetation selection all the way through defensible space. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. Next slide, please. Cal ODS is really kind of a conduit, if you will, for resources that happen there. So we're looking at emergency management and resource allocation, but they do have information that's there to assist you in developing response plans at a local level, but again, a broader picture because it's coming from a state level. Next slide, please. California Department of Education has lots of guidance that's out there, especially with COVID that's going on, to help schools reopen and address how it is that they want to keep students, faculty, guests, and families safe in the reopening process. It can be a little bit wordy in some spots, and I'm not trying to take anything away from anybody, but they had to develop this again, looking at a state level as opposed to more of a localized level. Next slide, please. Insurance. So working with Keenan, one of the things that we do is we assist our client JPAs and districts to fine tune some of those broader approaches, so that way they can look at it at whether it be a district or a JPA level or an individual site level. We're here to help them in opening plans for COVID. We have a resource page that has lots of information on it, and also trying to keep folks aware of emerging issues. And obviously, loss control consultant. I work one-on-one with the individual clients to try and help them come up to speed or assist them by sharing best practices that might be experienced in other regions, but bringing those here so they don't have to relearn those lessons. Next slide, please. SMUD and Southern California Edison. So they have lots of information on there talking about fire safety. So there were some disasters that happened. We'll talk about that a little bit later on that have kind of tempered what it is or how their responses to trying to everything from vegetation management around power poles through gas safety. And we'll get into the PSPS, which I'm sure everybody is very fond of. Next slide, please. And then local agencies. So here's a picture of different county pages, but even cities have their own pages. So this is where you get information resources that are more focused at a county and city level, to include departments of health that will have individual guidance, looking at school reopenings, as far as safety measures that may be specific to those locations. Next slide, please. Center for Disease Control. Again, lots of fun stuff that's out there. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be funny, but lots of good resources there. Everything from cleaning protocols, approved chemicals to address specific items, and also looking at emerging issues. So you can see on the webpage it's up there, they're looking at outbreaks, natural disasters, everything from water quality all the way through communicable diseases. So next slide, please. We don't know what we don't know. So one of the interesting things is how do we wrap our arms around an emerging issue that may not have been experienced locally? Looking at emerging threats and looking at global awareness, it's truly a global society. So something that started like the COVID-19, it moved from China relatively quickly and spread to a global pandemic with the age of business travel and things along those lines. What used to be regional outbreaks of things can turn into a much larger issue in a relatively short amount of time. But how do we identify those and how do we combat those things that we don't know? Next slide, please. It's a moving target. So conditions evolve. So some of the prior lessons learned, looking at the San Bruno gas incident, Camp Fire, Kincaid, things have changed. So one of the interesting things that everybody's been very focused on in the past was looking at things that happened at a local level. Fire is a big one. There hasn't been a school death. Somebody please correct me if I'm off on my dates, but there hasn't been a death in a school related to fire since the 50s. Has done a great job of testing the alarm. The kids line up, out to the flagpole we go. But we're finding that those environments are changing from a localized building fire to regional fires. Looking at everything from evacuation routes being closed. One of the interesting things in the upper right-hand corner map there is you're looking at evacuation areas that are covering entire counties as opposed to a localized fire incident. The one below is actually kind of the map of the Paradise Fire and how quickly that moved. So we're looking at more extreme events that are happening in places that it didn't happen before. So right now it's kind of on the fringes, but a good example is some of the things that happened in the Vacaville area when the fire started in the wildlands and then migrated into the city. So things that are continuing to evolve and change, and how do we be prepared for those? Next slide, please. So we've had a drought there. You can see, so this is the fire readiness and protection map that's from the state of California, looking at fire hazard severity zones. And this is just for state response areas. So this would be the CAL FIRE umbrella. There's also a map for regional, but the reason I wanted to publish this map and have you guys be able to look at it is the reds are extremes, going all the way through to the yellows, which are still still a hazard or medium hazard. As you can see, it covers pretty much the entire state. So as these fire incidents happen, it's very easy for them to migrate into those areas that aren't necessarily outlined in those high hazard areas. So how do we prepare ourselves? So heat, wind, fuel, and location is a big one. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the drought has, we're talking a 10-year drought. There was a break there, but we're seeing drier conditions, more extreme weather conditions, and extreme heat, and all of those lead to large fire events. Next slide, please. So from a biological standpoint, conditions continue to evolve. So we flu, COVID-19, and the things that we haven't heard of yet. So how are we looking at sanitation methods? How are we looking at, one of the big ones is as we move into flu season, if COVID is still active and out there, and it will be, how do we discern the difference between somebody who's reporting symptoms of flu versus COVID-19, and what's the school district's response going to be for those sites that that student was participating in? Are we looking at complete shutdowns, closures? How are we going to address that? Next slide, please. So in our current state, we're looking at basically the three topics that we wanted to expand on a little bit. And like I said, I'm moving relatively quickly, but this is, we could probably dedicate about several hours to each one of these, depending on how far you wanted to get into the weeds. But we're looking at COVID-19, public safety power shutoffs, and the wildfire piece. Next slide, please. So COVID-19, we're midstream, and I don't want to second guess anything that anyone is doing out there. But taking a look at your plan and best practices, one of the things that is available on, we have a COVID resource page that's located on the Keenan website that has a reopening plan that we worked in conjunction with Forensic Analytical, which is a consulting laboratory, to look at some of the protocols and things that are out there so we can address how school districts can open as kind of a model or a template. A lot of school districts already have something that's up and running, but depending on where you are, you could be finding yourself with distance learning, a blended approach, or full reopening, depending on your COVID levels and your local health department's restrictions. So in the distance learning piece, one of the challenges that has been out there is connectivity. So schools are great, but if people are working remotely, do they have the connectivity in order to be able to broadcast or conduct Zoom meetings or WebEx meetings from their home? Are they going to be site? How is that going to impact the community portion of it? And then ergonomic considerations. So if people are working at home, it's not an office setup. So if they're working from their kitchen table, how do we maintain neutral posture and minimize the potential for workers' comp injuries surrounding it? With the blended opening, again, the connectivity piece, not just the teachers, but also the students. In some of your more rural areas or in some areas that may be socioeconomically challenged, not everyone may have a broadband in their home or may not have access to the internet. So how do you address that? Again, we talked about the ergonomic considerations, cleaning frequency, and staff education. So one of the interesting things is everybody kind of pitching in together and looking at how do we minimize the viral load within the classroom. So everybody's kind of pitching in as far as the cleaning bit goes. But there are some regulations that come from Department of Pesticide Regulations as far as education goes for anybody who's going to be using a disinfectant or a germicide or sanitizer. They're considered pesticides, so there is some mandatory training that goes along with it. So one of the CDC recommendations as far as looking at plans for reopening is to maximize ventilation. What challenges does that bring as far as HVAC? So if we're opening our windows and doors and maximizing the amount of makeup air through our HVAC systems, are we going to achieve the targeted temperature in the classroom? Maybe not a big deal in, let's say, San Francisco or Sausalito, but if I'm in Needles, California, and it's mid-September, it's going to be pretty warm. So a lot of the systems are going to be taxed. Also, with the fire incidents that are happening, how do we maintain indoor air quality? Hopefully, everybody built in some what used to be snow days, but now are going to be smoke days. And then building reopening steps. There are some other considerations that need to be taken into account. So looking at some of the CDC and EPA requirements surrounding water systems that have not been run for a while, like Legionnaire's disease, building flushings, and system flushings to make sure that you don't spread that about. Again, CDC has some great resources on there that can help you out with that, and refer back to some EPA checklists. And then size is a big one. In talking to a lot of the clients that I work with, one of the challenges is there going to be enough actual classroom space to accommodate the social distancing portion of it? And everybody's come up with a unique way of addressing that. I think the biggest challenge is finding a forum in which best practices can be shared. And we'll touch more on that as we move forward. Next slide, please. So encourage questions. Like I said, I went through that relatively quickly. There's more information that folks would like, but in order to maintain our time frame here, this is basically an overview. So what is it? So moving to public safety power shutoff, PSPS, what is it? So this is actually a definition that was taken from Pacific Gas and Electric's webpage. So looking at weather events, so high winds, extreme dryness, or conditions that may cause sparking or fires, they will look at doing a safety shutdown of that area. Now, the interesting thing can be is, depending on how the grid is set up, the area that's being affected may be remote from the school site, but they're on the same leg of the grid. So you may find a power shut off in an area that doesn't seem like it's necessarily in that hazard area. So how do you get prepared for that? Next slide, please. So one of the things that Pacific Gas and Electric, and I'm focusing on them, I'm sure Southern Edison has something as well, is they're going to try and pre-announce the PSPS whenever possible. Understand that this is a multi-day event. So it's not going to be something that lasts for 2 hours and then they flip the lights back on. So how are you going to address that? Also, one of the things that was interesting is 2 years ago when we had a very large fire in our area, it's not covered under the PSPS, but they also shut off natural gas. So if you're dependent on natural gas for some of your internal systems, whether it be preparing food, let's say you have an on-site generator that you put on there and you piped into the natural gas system, understand that it's going to be shut down, has the potential of being shut down, and they'll send a representative out to go to every single house to relight all of your pilot lights. So you can't fire those up on your own. That has to be done by the electric municipal company that is in charge of that area. So we were actually out of gas for 4 days and out of electricity for 7. So we had some on-site generators. We were able to keep the frozen food frozen, but beyond that, you have to identify what are my critical systems, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So the shutdown could be based on weather. It could be day or night. So you may walk into a place that's already the power shut off, or it may happen midday. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for districts? So it could be day or night. They're going to try and, based on your contact information, give you advance notice or notice when they shut it off. Do you have those contact numbers updated? And do you have good phone numbers for, let's say, your dietary manager or director of dietary to come out? Do you have, again, looking at that communication piece, is there an agreement on site or an agreement in existence where if my elementary school on one side of town has the power shut off, can I transfer all of my frozen food to the high school across town so that way I don't lose $20,000 to $40,000 worth of frozen food? Or do you have power generation enough on site, and you've identified that as one of your critical infrastructure items to maintain through on-site generation? Also, understand your computer systems are going to be down. Payroll is going to be interesting. You may not be able to get into different records. Attendance is going to be interesting. So really taking a step backwards and looking at what are my critical pieces of infrastructure. What powers them? Some might be multi-powered. So you may have something with an electric pilot light, electric igniter, as opposed to a pilot light when it runs on gas. Will it continue to work? If it runs solely on electricity, is it critical? And what's that power load consumption going to look like? If I'm going to generate on site, do I have enough watts to be able to maintain that? So next slide, please. So another piece to look at is, and we talked about this briefly, is identifying those critical operating systems. So computer systems, servers, telephone systems. A lot of folks have moved to internet-based phone systems. If the power's down, the internet's down. When the power goes down, regular hard lines will continue to operate because they operate off of a different system. But in about 4 hours, your cell phone system is going to go down as well. They have battery backups at your individual towers, but after about 4 to 6 hours, unless they have generators on site, you're going to find, your connectivity starting to drop off. If you do have a generator on site, how's it fueled? Propane, diesel, natural gas. Each one of them have implications. So propane, obviously you've got a large propane tank on site. That brings some of its own issues. Diesel, air emissions, and looking at that bit of it. And if you're piped into the natural gas, in the event of a natural gas shutoff, you'll lose that power. One of the biggest things that I've been advocating for with my clients is how do we come up with almost a mutual aid type approach. So some districts have busing, others don't have busing. If we had a large event and had to move a lot of kids from point A to point B, how do we coordinate that as opposed to loading all the kids into the teachers' cars and driving them somewhere else? And looking at evacuation planning, and I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but looking at, can I use the high school's gymnasium as a rally point that's outside of the fire area, whether it be in my own district, a neighboring district, or a different county even, as opposed to having all the kids show up at the county fairgrounds and trying to keep them separated from everyone else. It brings all kinds of interesting issues, and we'll get into that a little bit further on. So next slide, please. Okay, so here again, identify critical operating systems. What are they dependent on? That mutual aid approach is huge. Can you depend on one another to support each other in a disaster, especially if it's going to be broader than, let's say, the single district, involving, let's say, multiple districts. Next slide, please. So living with wildfire. So this one is near and dear to my heart. It's something I've been working on closely with a number of my clients. A lot of this is information as far as the history surrounding it. So we're finding that the fire season is, in the Sierras and in surrounding areas, has grown by 75 days. So it's starting earlier, ending later, drier conditions, more high heat events in conjunction with high winds, resulting in more large or extreme fire events. Next slide, please. So here's just some statistics really quickly. So we burn roughly 500,000 acres annually over the last couple of decades. 8 of the 10 largest fires occurred during the same time frame. 179% increase in the number of acres burned from 96 to 2015. And it's continuing to get larger. So we're seeing larger fire events being increased in frequency as well as area. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting things about it is, and I won't get into all of this fun stuff, but the wildland-urban interface. So the wildland-urban interface is broken up into kind of where you see the forest stop and then suburbia begin. A good example of that was the Coffee Park area. So the fire came over the hill, and then it came from the wildland into the urban area based on those structures which were at the interface and then spread into the city itself. The winds and conditions were such that there wasn't a lot of time to get folks out of the way of the fire. So the effort was, in some areas, limited to going door to door, getting folks out, as opposed to actually fighting the fire. They had embers that were jumping probably a mile ahead of the fire based on the wind. So they were getting spot fires and it's spreading very quickly. And we're seeing that happen even in, again, the last lightning complex fires that happened that came down into Vacaville. And Lake County has had a number of fires where the winds have taken it from that wildland area into that urban interface. Next slide, please. So schools often follow construction. So as people want to move into those urban areas, and things are changing a little bit, a lot of the millennials out there are looking at moving back into the cities. But in the old days, you had this suburban sprawl. As the suburban sprawl happened, as they built new construction, the schools followed to serve the populations that were there. So we see a lot of schools that may not necessarily be directly in what they call the WUI, the wildland urban interface, or in the intermix, which is actually intermingled with the trees. The structures are intermingled with the trees. But we're seeing them in those suburban areas that are more prone to fires. One of the interesting things about it too is when you build a new school or you're looking at doing expansions or renovations, often part of it is landscaping, and some of the pretty vegetation that's out there is not the stuff that you want next to your buildings. A good example is old juniper bushes. They were very favored in the 50s and 60s as low-growing shrubs around different office buildings. Those things are super flammable and not recommended as part of the best practices that are there. So how do you take a look at your vegetation, how you're setting out your outbuildings, so sheds, 40-yard containers that may be filled with emergency supplies, new additions, things along those lines, to minimize your fire exposure. Also, there's some challenges with surrounding properties. So for those folks that are in that kind of rural area, the footprint of the school looks great, but they may be surrounded by pasture lands with 4-foot tall grass. How do you coordinate with neighbors to address that, even though you've addressed those things? And we're going to get into the building hardening and the building fire focus a little bit later on. The one thing you're looking at is to be able to control those ladder fuels. So fire that starts on the ground is easier to control than that which is in the treetops. So it has to have a method from getting from the ground to the treetops. So it'll follow your grass, get to your scrubs and grasses, and then continue to climb. So part of looking at those best practices, which we'll get into here in the next couple of slides, is looking at how do you interrupt that ladder fuel approach to minimize the fire risk. Next slides, please. So being proactive is the best defense. Okay, there's lots of resources I've listed on here. They're on the resource page in the back as well. I listed FireSafe Marin because they have lots of great information, but there's also FireSafe fill in the blanks. It could be FireSafe Sacramento or FireSafe YOLO or organizations that are out there, excuse me, that will give site-specific recommendations based on their locality to try and address those things. But in looking at the CAL FIRE best practices, next slide, please. You're really looking at creating that defensible space. So how do you stop the fire from rapidly coming up to your building, heating your building, and catching it on fire? Defensible space is your first line of defense, and it's the one that you can control directly. Next slide, please. So there's 3 real ways in which a building catches or a structure catches on fire. So radiant heat, firebrand or ember casting, and direct flame. So radiant heat, the temperature is high enough that it spontaneously combusts and bursts into flame. So it doesn't have to actually come in contact with it. It could just be have a combustion temperature that's low enough that it will combust based just on the radiant heat. Ember casting, we were talking about with the high wind events, it will pick up smoldering small bits and it will blow them up to a mile or more away and start spot fires. So looking at the building hardening piece, we'll look at the ember casting as well. And a direct flame is just as it says, the fire is actually up against the building and ignites the building or the combustible structure, portions of the structure that way. But one of the interesting things as kind of a side note is they discovered that a lot of folks had upgraded their windows to dual pane vinyl windows or sliders that were dual pane with vinyl frames. During these fire events, the temperature was high enough that the vinyl melted and the glass just fell out. So when that happened, all of the embers and direct flames went directly into the structure. So even though it was a stucco house, which isn't readily flammable, it was able to enter in and just catch the carpet drapes and those things on fire based on those vinyl clad windows and sliders. Next slide, please. So FEMA put this little picture together to kind of show the different zones. So zone 1 is looking at that 0 to 30 feet, and you're looking at how do I minimize anything that's combustible in there. So one of the biggest challenges is looking at, a lot of time landscapers will put shrubs right up against the building, or they'll bring in ground cover that's gorilla hair as opposed to large chunks of bark, and it'll be right next to the building. Super flammable. It gets caught underneath your eaves, and it'll catch any wooden portions of the truss or overhang the eave itself, and it'll ignite that. So how do you keep that 0 to 5 feet pretty much free of anything that's combustible? And then it moves out from there. So next slide, please. So zone 1, that 0 to 30 feet, remove all dead plants, grasses, and weeds. You're looking at, how do I just create this defensible space so that way nothing in that area will burn? Remove dry leaves and pine needles from the roofs, especially with a lot of these flat roofs. There's some old oak trees, old pine trees that are growing next to them, and either the pine needles or the leaves themselves will build up next to your HVAC units. If you have conduit or ducting that's up there, it'll get stuck underneath it, and it stays and just builds up this source of combustion, and it can be easily removed. Keep tree branches 10 feet away from your roof and other trees. So you don't want any overhanging branches. It'll just, in the event of a fire, it will just rain all of those burning leaves and things down on the roof, increasing the potential for fire. Next slide, please. Zone 2, so that's 30 to 100 feet. So you're looking at that vertical spacing. So you don't want your grasses to be more than 4 inches tall. Check with your local fire jurisdiction or your fire departments. They may have something lower than that, but 4 is the rule of thumb. Create horizontal spaces between your shrubs and trees, so you don't, again, looking at that upper picture on the right-hand side, you can see how it goes from the shrubs to the shorter tree to the tall tree, creating that ladder. So you're looking at, how do I interrupt that ladder? And then vertical spacing, again, looking at, how do I keep my shrubs from growing underneath my trees, and then how do I keep my trees and shrubs away from my buildings? Next slide, please. So here's that example. So looking at on the left, 6 feet minimum from the ground to the first hanging limbs. In the center there, it shows that ladder fuel approach, and that's what you're trying to interrupt. And then if you do have shrubs that are growing underneath your trees that you don't want to remove, then you're looking at 3 times the shrub height to your first set of branches. Next slide, please. Minimum horizontal clearance. So on the ground where it's nice and flat is easy, but as you start climbing up slopes, it gets a little more difficult. So this is just a graphic that can help you with spacing out your trees and shrubs, and again, breaking up that ladder fuel approach. Excuse me. Next slide, please. Also, one of the interesting things about it is with the push for green, mowing and tilling and those kinds of things, there are alternatives. So even California Department of Transportation will hire teams of goats that come out, and they will strip everything from the ground to as high as they can reach. Also, it's kind of neat to see sheep and goats on the hill. Now, goats will nibble everything that's green. Sheep will eat it to the bare ground. That was the big cattle rancher and sheep wars in the Midwest back in the day, because sheep will actually denude the pasture, whereas goats will just eat it down to ground level. So if you're really looking at getting rid of that stuff, bring in the sheep, and they will eat, and they'll like I said again, they'll follow a path for everything that they can reach, and it will limit you from having to break all that brush. Now, here's an interesting thing too for you folks who might be in a moisture climate. Goats will eat poison oak. So if they're mixed in with poison oak, they'll eat it too. They like ivy. They really like your landscaping, so if you can keep them separated from that. But if you have a hillside somewhere or you have an open space and you put them out there, like I said, they'll nibble it down to nothing. Next slide, please. Okay, excuse me. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Although aesthetically pleasing, there are some vegetation types like buckbrush, manzanita, juniper that are super flammable, and you don't want them around your building. They call it flame grass for a reason. So if you've got large, 20-year-old flame grasses, or what do they call them? Cat's tails, things along those lines, super flammable. Not only that, the duff that they leave behind, so all the leftover leaves that they drop, again, you're just building that ladder fuel piece up. Depending on your geographic location, there are a number of fire safe councils that are out there. So that bottom web link will take you to that main page where you can find, based on your county, if it has one or not, or you can form your own. San Luis Obispo, University at SLO down there, they actually have on their website, based on your geographic area, and I think it's on the next slide, selections of things that are not fireproof, but not fireproof, but fire resistant or drought resistant. So that way you don't have all this dead, dry vegetation that you have to constantly trim, prune, and remove. Okay, so evacuation. One of the biggest challenges that we've seen in moving, as this continues to evolve, is the evacuation piece. So like I had mentioned before, schools are great at, the fire alarm goes off, all the kids line up, they go out to the flagpole or whatever the designated area is. But now we're starting to see not a localized fire, but a large regional fire. So the Kincaid fire here, you can see one of the interesting things is from its point of origin, the mandatory evacuation zones went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So we're starting to see that more and more. So it's going from where the source starts is usually to either a large body of water or to an area that's not flammable. It's crossing major evacuation routes. So in this instance, they closed Highway 101. I had never seen them close Highway 101 before. Anything traveling north was stopped and turned around. If you left, you're not coming back. So one of the interesting things is if you are doing an evacuation, anybody who's accompanying the students, they're not coming back to their homes. So how are you going to address that, and where are you going to go? So if you have to leave, and believe it or not, from top to bottom of this is probably from the top, and I'm looking at this kind of in a northwest direction, is probably 75 miles, 50 miles, give or take. So you're looking at evacuating to somewhere about 50 miles away, right? So how is that going to impact your evacuation plan? Do you have a place that you can go? We had mentioned things like they'll set up an evacuation point at, let's say, the fairgrounds. How are you going to control the kids? What's that release point going to look like? Do you have busing to get you to and from where it is you're going, with the understanding that your buses are most likely not going to be able to go in and pick up round 2 of your kids? Have you established those relationships with your neighboring districts to approach this from a mutual aid perspective, so that way, if they have extra buses but don't have to evacuate, could you utilize those? If you need to move food, can you set up, anything from as simple, or I shouldn't say simple, but as routine as submitting payroll? What if this happened on a payroll day? Can you do it from a neighboring district or a neighboring site, as opposed to finding yourself at kind of the mercy of wherever it is that they send you? So next slide, please. So evacuation considerations. We talked about a couple of those, but how will students be transported? I have some districts that have their own internal busing, some that contract it, and others that don't have it at all. They're reliant on another district that provides, a neighboring district that provides busing for them. In the event of an emergency, if you have contracted busing, do you have a language in your agreement that you get priority over somebody calling up and saying, I want to rent your buses? What's that going to look like? And is the transportation asset large enough where you can move all of your students at once? Once you do get to your evacuation area, will it allow for segregation of students? So obviously you don't want the general public intermixing with your students. How do you control access to bathrooms? There's a lot of complications. Also, one of the interesting things that we saw in the past is they're closing major thoroughfares, Highway 101, things like major freeways. Parents may not be able to get back to where you're evacuating to pick up your kids, to pick up their students. So you may find that you're going to have those students for an extended period of time. And what's that going to look like? Is there a plan for safeguarding the students for that period of time? So in other words, access control. So if, let's say they have to sleep overnight. Again, you don't want to be in a large gymnasium and trying to squeeze everybody into the corner and keeping the general public out. That's where that agreement with, let's say, your neighboring high school district. Can we use your gym? Controlled access, bathroom, showers, and we can have food brought in if necessary. Also controlled access in and out, and it's on an existing school site. So it provides you some security as far as access to students, and then students not just wandering off and what happened to Timmy or Susie? We haven't seen them in 5 hours. So next slide, please. So shelter in place considerations. So if you do have to shelter in place, there are a number of regulations out there that talk about protecting workers from smoke. How do you maintain indoor air quality? So one of the things you're gonna have to look at too is what's your plan for staff that have to leave. So if your dietary crew walks up to you and says, and saying to you, all of our homes are in the mandatory evacuation area, we're going to pick up our stuff and we're leaving, you have a plan B. Who can step into those roles? Have you tabletopped this? Have you practiced it? Have you looked at creating those mutual aid relationships with those neighboring districts? And have you exercised that once or twice? So, our key job descriptions readily available. So one of the interesting things is if I'm the IT guy and I have to step into, let's say the dietary manager's role to get some ordering of some food that's in here, do I know what that looks like? So having those in kind of a, lack of a better term, a battle box. We have your job descriptions, roles and responsibilities, so you can set up your command center and you can work the incident in an orderly fashion. VoIP phone systems are going to be down. So if it's voice over internet provider, if the internet goes down, you have no phones. What's an alternative for that? We talked about loss of refrigeration. Cell phone repeaters work for a while, but they only have limited battery backup. Talked about the smoke piece of it, and then site security. If you are evacuated to another site, how are you going to provide security for that? How are you going to establish shifts? How can you bring in some other folks from the outside? What's that going to look like? So it's really kind of stepping backwards and saying, what does our plan look like? We had talked about in the past, we've done really well at looking at that localized fire piece, but starting to insert those what ifs. So what if we have to leave the campus? What if we have to leave the area? What if we have to leave the county? What is that going to look like? Next slide, please. And then recovery, obviously, you're going to have to come back when it's all done. So you're looking at site cleanup and protecting workers during the site cleanup stuff. One of the agencies for resources that I forgot to mention, and I apologize for that, was Cal OSHA has a number of different guidance documents on protecting workers, whether it be from smoke, during post-event cleanup, fit testing for respirator requirements, heat illness injury prevention for those folks who will be stuck outside. Make sure that you're touching bases with those regulatory pieces as well. For fire damaged structures, I was working with a district that did have some portables that were fire damaged, and the teachers wanted to go back into them. Hats off for the dedication piece of it. But the fire marshal had red tagged the buildings as unsafe to occupy. And I said, I know your favorite coffee mug is in there, okay? But you can't go in there. And they're like, okay, we get that. But what about the books? I was like, you'll never get the smell out of the books. What about the desks? They're melted. The amount of, enter into an unsafe building to salvage, a few items is probably not worth it. So, be very careful about that. You don't want somebody to get hurt after the incident because they re-entered an unsafe building. Air quality is a big one. Looking at how you protect those folks, and then also recovery from things like smoke damage. Get in contact with your loss control representative if you need assistance on that. We're ready to help. There's also available resources out there on those resource regulatory pages that we talked about as far as from Cal OSHA. Next slide, please. So, okay, in kind of a summary, fire activity continues to pose heightened risk. We're seeing more large-scale events, more extreme weather conditions that are fueling as well as driving these fires. So in stepping backwards, looking at the risk as far as for structure damage, if you're looking at solely from the property end of it, how do we build those defensible spaces? And I just did an overview of the materials that are available to help you establish those defensible spaces. It gets into the nitty gritty. So what size should your soffit vents screens be to prevent embers from entering? It gets into that level of detail, and a lot of these things are overlooked, but if you're getting stuff blowing into your attics, hey, you know what's going to happen. Looking at fuel reduction best practices, so there are a number of agencies out there, whether it be CAL FIRE, your local fire district, things along those lines, where they can give some guidance and advice and share best practices for looking at that fuel reduction. We're talking about breaking up those ladder fuels. The building hardening practices, again, are listed. Landscaping is a big one. So you want to have that zone where there's that's defensible, that clean and green area that we talked about a little bit earlier, to really stop that fire from reaching your building and spreading to areas that you don't want. Areas in proximity to the wildland interface, wildland urban interface, have some interesting challenges. And I'd be happy to have a conversation because that's a whole day unto itself at a different point. Stay in touch with the evacuation orders. One of the interesting things is early on, information was very scarce as far as which direction is the fire moving, what's the next evacuation warning going to be. Those things have improved dramatically. So there's a lot of places that you can go to get real-time updates as far as where that fire is going and what it's doing and whether or not it's going to be threatening you and your structures. And then again, the plan is great, but you have to work the plan. So once you have that plan in place, some tabletop drills are great, just to exercise those different roles and having folks switch roles just in case somebody happened to be out sick that day, or they or that person had to leave because they're in a mandatory evacuation area before it got to you, so they need to get to their home, get their horses. I don't know what it happens to be. They'll come up with some interesting stuff. And then last but not least, looking at that reopening piece is something that should be formalized, as well as building those mutual aid agreements with your neighboring districts. So it's really, how do we get everybody talking to one another, to share resources, to share space. Because as we continue to see these things evolve, it's really looking at pushing folks out of the areas that they're used to operating in. Next slide, please.
And with that, thank you, Frank. Now we'll turn it over to Jennifer and Kelly to provide their perspective, as this has been an area that they have found themselves affected. And so I would like to begin with Jennifer, since she sat in multiple calls with the Department of Education as we, with CASBO, started engaging the department on what we needed as best practices that needed to be set up in place. Jennifer?
So my experience is from last year. Currently, I'm with an online college, so I haven't had as much experience this year, and I know there's a lot more going on. And it's just been amazing and phenomenal to see all the work that K-12 is doing to be successful in this really odd environment that we're in, because there's so many different factors affecting schools and whether they're open or closed. It's not just COVID. And Kelly has a lot of really current information to share with you. But last year, when we gathered after the original PSPS rolling blackouts, we gathered at CDE, and it was kind of alarming because there were so many different items affecting school districts. So in Vacaville, we had some of our schools were older than others, and so we had difficulty with the electrical panels. One school had multiple electrical panels that needed to be upgraded to be able to hook up a generator just to keep power on. And Kelly can talk about some of the resolutions to some of these items, but that was one of the items I brought up. And then we had rural school districts that were represented in that meeting that had buildings that were built in the late 1800s and early 1900s that couldn't even bring in a generator and just upgrade a panel. They actually needed all new electrical wiring. So there's a lot that's facing school districts when these items pop up on our radar, but a lot of it is unknown. You won't know until you actually pursue a resolution, and you just need to really be cognizant of the fact of tracking those expenditures, because they're one time in nature. And if the folks at CDE, who then shares it with the folks in the legislature, don't know that actual dollar value of that impact, we're not going to see a lot of movement to help schools with backfilling those funds. And we know that every dollar that we have to use on an unexpected expense, we're taking out of being able to use to improve student achievement. So it's really important that we track that. But I'm going to pass it on to Kelly now. So when I left Vacaville, I was very fortunate. I had an amazing director who was able to just step into the CBO role and she has had multiple items all at once going on this year, and they have done a phenomenal job. So I'm going to let her talk about some of that.
Hi, thanks for having me. So yeah, in Vacaville, along with a lot of other school districts in the state, we've had a lot of challenges just opening schools this year. I don't know about the rest of you, but I know we had multiple additional board meetings over the summer just to talk about how to reopen schools. We were looking at with the COVID impact and how we wanted to address that need in our schools. And so we had a board meeting in July, and we decided to open with a hybrid model. And so then the governor came out with his address, and so then we were looking at the watch list and where we were at, and now we've moved to the colors. And so Solano County is in the purple, and so we were on the watch list when we originally opened schools, so we opened in a distance learning model. And luckily, we are a school district that already had one-to-one devices for our students. So then it was just a matter of distribution, which was a challenge in itself. So our sites were still closed over the summer, so most of the distribution happened here at the district office. And our technology team was amazing in deploying and communicating. We sent out multiple surveys over the summer. We surveyed parents, we surveyed students, we surveyed our staff and teachers to see what the needs were regarding technology. We wanted to know how many students were out there that would have a connectivity issue. So we were on the hunt for hotspots, as many of you were, to try to figure out how many we needed in our district in order for all of our students to be able to connect. So we were able to secure some hotspots. We're a district of 13,000 students, and we ended up after the surveys realizing we needed 275 hotspots for some of our staff that are just in rural locations as well as our students. So we were able to do that through Verizon. And then we distributed our Chromebooks. And so that was a challenge. We ended up, about half of our Chromebooks were distributed, 6,500. We ended up sending out to families at home so they were able to access the distance learning model through the Zoom platform is what we chose to use here in our district, along with Google Classroom. And so, so that was a challenge, but our technology department was amazing in getting all of those things out. We still had small groups of students that just weren't able to either have the hotspots work or those types of connectivity issues. So we also chose to open 2 of our sites, our locations in our multi-purpose rooms, so that students could come with their parents and do their distance learning on location at our sites. So then they were still able to connect and get the teaching that they needed. So yeah, we have a great team here in Vacaville. We're very fortunate. The communication part was probably one of our biggest struggles. We ended up using an app called GroupMe. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but GroupMe has been a lifesaver through just COVID and opening schools. And we have all of our leadership team on the GroupMe. And so we can easily send a text to the group, what are you doing about this? And somebody responds very quickly. So we had that set up for COVID, which then leads me into the fires, which we also then were able to access immediately because we had already set up that communication platform. And then we also used a program called Blackboard to communicate with our parents to send out text messages as well as emails. And so we used that to try to reach as many parents as we could. The fires were a little bit more challenging. Pretty much the whole north side, when we talk about Vacaville, we talk about the north side and the south side because 80 runs pretty much through the middle of the town. So the north side was evacuated first. And so we just couldn't connect with a lot of people. I myself was an evacuee. I live on the north side. So I came into work at about 3 o'clock that morning, the morning of the fires, and went right into the command center that we had set up here at the district office. And we started coordinating immediately with Solano County OES. So we worked with the Office of Emergency Services as well as Solano County Health. Because in addition to it being a fire, we also then had the pandemic on top of that. So we had to be very aware of social distancing in our evacuation centers. So Solano County Public Health sent some nurses out to our 4 evacuation sites, which were all on the south side, because that was the side of town that had not been evacuated. And they were able to do the temperature checks as people were coming in. We put messages out on Facebook for donations that were needed. And the community was great in responding to that. We had lots of blankets and pillows and food and water. And a lot of the local restaurants and vendors also delivered food. So we had like BJ's restaurant delivered pizzas to all of our evacuation centers. We had a snow cone vending truck that came around and gave snow cones to everyone. It was just those little things that really helped. So what we realized one of the biggest challenges was the pets. We didn't really have anywhere or any way to handle all of the different types of animals that came into the evacuation centers. So that was a really large challenge. So then we were able to communicate and reach out to the animal shelters and other local businesses in the area that could help with bringing different crates and water bowls and those types of things. And then once we realized we were going to be in an overnight situation, we actually worked with a lot of the local churches, and they were able to bring cots and other blankets and bedding as well to set up for that overnight situation. Another challenge that we found ourselves in is we actually had a registered sex offender show up at one of our locations. These are just things you just don't think about, when you're preparing for these things. So then we had to figure out where are we going to put the sex offender overnight and separate them and then have security set up to manage that. So it's just all those challenges that come up in the moment that you have to prepare for. So what we did was we set up a Google Sheets document for all of our different evacuation centers where staff were able to sign up for the different shifts. We did 2-hour shift rotations for a 3-day period so that we always had staff on site that were able to help the evacuees. So that seemed to work pretty well as well. And then for afterwards, I know we're running out of time here. It also was very nice that our board president is actually a retired chief for the fire department. And so he actually really helped us in connecting with a lot of the resources, as well as his daughter actually works at OES. So we had those inside connections. So use those if you have them, because it was really helpful in just the coordination and getting everything set up at the beginning. And then as far as the funding goes, just looking at it from a CBO perspective, I've been working with our local OES office to be able to submit for all of those different types of reimbursements for being an evacuation center. And I wasn't sure where to go first. I didn't know if I was supposed to go directly to FEMA or do I go to my local OES? And because OES is the one that directed our district to open up the evacuation centers, we worked with them and then they work with FEMA and then it comes back down the other way when the funds come back to the district. So keeping great documentation is very important. You want to know how many evacuees were at your location, what sort of services that they received, what staff you had working during those different shifts. All of that documentation is very important in order to be able to be reimbursed. So you need somebody that can coordinate that for you and make sure that at every location that information is being tracked. So that's been very crucial in order to be able to be reimbursed for our expenses. But all in all, it's gone well considering, having to be a shelter for an evacuation site during a pandemic. Everyone was very cooperative. The community has been great. And, there's always those silver linings that come out of these situations. And you see those heroes in action. And that's been wonderful to see. Really brought the community together. So thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for your stories and for your leadership, Kelly. We truly appreciate you. And then we know that we haven't received questions and we are running a little bit behind on time, but I did want to leave our audience with our contact information. Judy Miller made a comment that not every district has property coverage for spoiled food in the event that there is a notice of a power shutoff. So those impacts as well of losing perishable items, recognizing if there's an ability to move products so that you don't lose them. We had heard stories this year of school sites getting refrigerated trucks and loading up $20,000 worth of food so that they wouldn't lose their milk and their products. And so we know these are just complicated times, and we believe that we just wanted to make sure we were sharing best practice, especially that we're still in a pandemic. So we truly appreciate you, Kelly, and we leave folks with our contact information. If there's any more details, we added all of the information in the research guide, which is part of the PowerPoint presentation. Do you have any comments, Tasha?
I don't. Just thank you for that insight. There were all those little nuances that you would never consider. And now our audience has a chance to consider those. And hopefully we just keep adding to the conversation. Thank you for your leadership. Thanks all of you for being on our call today and sharing your wisdom and experience. We're very grateful.